Hi, good afternoon, everybody. This is Katie Chuba from the Hartland Area Chamber of Commerce. Thank you today for joining us on today's webinar. Today is June 22nd, 2020. And as we reopen and move into our post-COVID-19 pandemic, if you will, we are doing another multi-chamber webinar today for you. And I'm talking and stalling, hope you don't mind, as we wait for everyone that registered to join us today. So over the next couple of minutes, we'll just do a few introductions. Today's topic is, we're going to talk about OSHA safety requirements and best practices. So we are joined today by some experts and engineers and project managers and legal and marketing and HR, mainly from Environmental Resource Group. And I'm going to turn it over first just to say hello from the chambers. I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues, and we'll start with Pam at the Brighton Chamber. Hi, Pam. How are you doing today?
Hey, Katie. I'm doing great. How about you?
I'm fantastic.
Well, I'd like to welcome you as well. And hi, Janelle. Janelle will be on in just a sec. And thank you, all of you wonderful people, for presenting today on this very important topic. We appreciate you taking the time from your various locations. And we look forward to your presentation. And thank you, all of you guests that are signing on. We're glad you're with us today. Janelle?
All right. Hi, Pam. Hi, Katie. And welcome to everybody that's joining us right now. We are so excited to have this great presentation together. And as Katie mentioned, we've got all sorts of different individuals and areas of expertise on the call today or on our Zoom. And I'm Janelle Best. I'm with the Howell Chamber, and we are really looking forward to all the information that you guys have to present. So thanks for taking time to do this. And as always, we love our collaborations with our other chamber partners in Livingston County. And I'm going to give it back to you, Katie. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, you guys. You guys always give just wonderful introductions, just so you know. So I appreciate you both for collaborating as well. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it right now. I'm going to turn it over to Peggy Straub. And Peggy, did I say your last name correctly?
You did.
Okay,
yes.
And Peggy, you're the Director of Marketing Federal Projects with ERG, is the acronym for Environmental Resources Group. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right, so tell us a little bit about yourself, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, and hello, happy Monday. I think that there's a little bit about summer that allows us to feel like we can solve the world's biggest problems, and summer couldn't come fast enough for us here in Michigan. It allows us to kick our shoes off and try to gain some new hope and perspective. And especially this year, I think we need this. Thank you again for the Chamber for allowing us to give you some of the thoughts in the next hour. We appreciate your time and hope that we leave everyone with a little bit more clarity in this ever-changing COVID situation. Just to let you know, our presentation is an open forum. We invite dialogue and encourage you to ask questions. Just like all of you, we're working through this new normal with you, trying to stay on top of the new challenges and opportunities, the struggles that come from them. My name is Peggy Straub, and I'm the Director of Marketing and Business Development for ERG. My primary responsibility here at ERG is to identify strategies and create teaming opportunities that strengthens ERG's market presence, as well as collaborate our marketing division to ensure ERG reaches expanded markets. I carry the simple task today, and that's my job, is to introduce two knowledgeable guys who are going to offer information and answer questions regarding COVID-19 and the preparedness of re-entering the workplace, both from the employee perspective, as well as the employer's need to move businesses forward and safely. ERG's ownership team will not risk safety for anything, so pivoting to this new normal has opened some new opportunities for us, as we hope to share those with you and help you navigate through this unprecedented times. I'd like to take the stage just for a second and oh gosh, I lost my place. We're very excited today to announce that ERG was awarded the Michigan Celebrates Top 50 Companies to Watch in 2020. This is one of the highest and most prestigious awards for any Michigan small business. And I'm very proud to work with a company with so many talented colleagues. So congratulations and hats off to us. Anyway, Michigan has been hit so hard with COVID-19, and it's only through the resilience and perseverance of people like you, companies such as yours and such as ours, that we are making it through and hopefully coming out better on the other side. COVID changed the way we do business. It changed how we live our lives. It's controlling our conversations from work to grocery stores, from families to strangers. It's the new normal, the novel virus, the terms, we are all in this together, flattening the curve. Who would know that social distancing would be our new normal? With the massive amount of free and available information, it's hard to know who to listen to and what is current. Masks, do you wear them? Don't you? When and where? Is it the law or is it a suggestion? How to keep up with all of these changes is really, it's a challenge to all of us. And it's true, we are all in this together. Luckily for me, I have colleagues here at ERG like Matt Germane to walk us through the best practices that we have learned here at ERG. Again, ERG's owners are dedicated to employee safety, and that has allowed us to pivot our business model and continue to move forward as we do so. And then we also have Brandon Grisco from Fasoon Bond Law Firm, who will provide us a lawful interpretation and perspective from all of these changing laws and orders. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Matt, and he can give a little introduction about himself.
Thank you, Peggy. Yes, good afternoon, everyone. This is Matt Germane. Like most of you, or many of you, I'm working from home today from my basement office, and I can look out my window here in the basement kitchen and see hay fields and cornfields. Now, that brings a little bit to my introduction. Having lived on the farm, we just celebrated our 75th year in 2019 here in the Hartland area. And I've been privileged to work as an environmental engineer for almost 37 years now. And obviously currently working at ERG. I've had my own private practice in the past, so I know firsthand about the business difficulties that we're all going through. And we felt that it was important, since we were talking about issues dealing with regulations, to also bring a lawyer in to our mix today. And Brandon Grisco is going to do a brief introduction of himself at this time, and then we'll get started.
Hey guys and girls, I'm Brandon Grisco over here in Northville with the law firm of Fasoon Bond. Kind of a full service firm, tend to focus on business clients and also represent municipalities and other local government type entities. And I concentrate my representation on business leaders, leadership teams, HR professionals, and labor relations professionals, specifically in matters of corporate business law and labor and employment and HR type matters. So really excited to be here, and thanks to everybody at the various chambers and ERG for inviting me. And because I'm a lawyer, I can't go more than 5 seconds without giving a legal disclaimer. So I'm going to do that, and I really appreciate everybody just using kind of common sense here. You know, we're putting this information out there as informational, should not be relied on as legal advice, and to the extent that you guys need legal advice about a specific situation, need to work with your legal counsel on that, because everybody's specific circumstances are different, and even, you know, a slight variation in the facts, of course, can alter how things should be interpreted. So I do appreciate you guys joining in with us here today and listening to me go on and on, but I also appreciate just using the common sense to know that this isn't official legal advice. And with that, I'll turn it back to Matt to kickstart the substantive portion of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon. Well, we're really going to try to jump right into some basics about the COVID-19. We know that it's a disease and that it's caused by a virus, and that it can spread easily through the air, whether you're breathing, coughing, talking, sneezing. And we know that it also, you can get infected by touching things that may also have the virus on it. So the state, in their wisdom, issued back in May a Safe Start plan. And they divided the entire state into 6 steps in order to get back to normal. And these 6 steps are shown here on the screen. I know we may have some people watching in other states as well, and your state may have something similar. The purpose for this was initially to try to minimize the impact on hospitals. And to do that, it required a lot of people to stay at home and even work at home. So where we're at right now in the state of Michigan is what I'm calling phase 4.5. And this is kind of like a hybrid because part of the state's in phase 4 and part of the state's in phase 5. The things to keep in mind here is that regardless of whether you're in retail, public transportation, food and bars, you can see all the different lists of businesses that the state has identified. There are still a few things that are common to most of these. Maintaining a 6-foot physical distance, for example, and it's recommended that masks be worn whenever possible. The specifics for phase 4 are that personal care services, bottle returns, places of public amusement, gyms and fitness centers are not to be allowed. I know there's been some court cases recently on gyms, and I think even in other parts of the state, the bottle returns have been open now for about a week. So the state is not always clear on what they want to do, which is unfortunate and causes a lot of the confusion that we're trying to identify today to clarify. So 2 of the things that I want to point out that the Safe Start plan requested is that it's important for employees to use PPE, and it should be provided by their employers when it's necessary. And secondly, that you need to develop and train employees on these procedures and protocols. The grisly details in the state of Michigan, and this is as of last week, over 6,000 deaths, many of them in nursing homes. And specific to our county, in Livingston County, we had 28 confirmed deaths and 521 people that have been identified as impacted. Now, I would say it's safe to say over the last 3 to 4 months, we have all had information overload, whether you were watching the programs, the weekly and daily press conferences at the White House, or all the different executive orders that the governor has been issuing. We would say that if you look back to a poll that was done in 2016, it was identified that 87% of the employees worldwide are not engaged at work, that 39% have no idea of what their company's goals and objectives are, and they're unfamiliar with the company's performance. So if this is the status quo before COVID hit, what is it like today? I would suggest a lot of those numbers have gone down. And so as a result, it's really important that we as business owners really focus on leadership. This is an opportunity to reinvent your business, to tackle these business conditions that are changing, obviously following the common sense essentials, being considerate of employees and customers because they approach this virus from different perspectives. So like any good engineer, I couldn't give a presentation that was worthwhile without including some formulas and equations and graphs and charts. So I just want to inform you to pay attention because I don't want to disappoint. So we have to look at leadership and management. They're actually two different things. And this is the mathematical equation that I alluded to. You know, leadership is the things where you develop direction and vision and thinking, planning the company goals for the future. But management is different. That is, how are you going to accomplish those goals? What are personnel and expectations? It's the execution portion. And I submit to you that that's something that's very important that we have to focus on at this time. So once your vision and your execution are done, it doesn't matter if you spent all this time to develop something that's really good for your company until it gets shared carefully to all the employees. Because when something is shared by all, it becomes a company belief. However, if you're just sharing it to your employees, it's more like a poster on a wall that might be seen but ignored. So the COVID response needs something developed by the business that will attract both your employees' time and attention to be successful. So Albert Einstein said something really cool. You can read it for yourself. The thing about leadership, it's something that has to be done even in good times and bad times. So, you know, if you look at your leaders, your company owners as being creative, motivated, positive, honest, and so on, having empathy for employees and committed to success, those are all good things. And my point is that we can't give those things up even right now during this crisis. Because right now we're in the crazy uncertainty time. It's important that you embrace that uncertainty and develop and implement plans with confidence that will help both your employees and your customers and clients have the confidence to come to your business and continue working. So the point is that Henry Ford said that if you think you can or if you think you can't, either way you're right. So if you think about that, it helps you understand why planning is so important. So the practical tips for COVID-19 response are pretty standard, pretty common sense. It's one of those things where you have to understand that some employees are going to be afraid and others are going to not be so afraid. As an owner, it's important to be truthful, but still be optimistic. And as I said before, embracing these new opportunities and planning for the future. The common sense things, I don't need to spend a lot of time on these, but the one thing that I do want to bring out is that this disinfection of common areas is pretty important. And the other thing that the Safe Start plan that the state developed that we'll get to in a bit is it is important that your business develop a process and procedure on how you're going to handle those employees who become sick while you're in the process of reopening or being in business. You know, at ERG, we were, in many aspects, some of our projects were considered essential. So we really didn't shut down. We had to modify our approach on the fly, such as developing a disinfectant plan for all of our company trucks. And perhaps your business has had to do something similar. So here's one of two graphs that I wanted to provide. And this shows a time view going back to February, even before the first US death was reported, on how employees, or people in general, I should say, view the coronavirus. So to put it in perspective, we've got about 35% of the people that are not very worried or not worried at all. So if you look at the flip side, that tells you that on average, most of the people are somewhat worried or very worried about coronavirus. And tied that together with the economy, you can see that in this case, only about 14% of the people are not concerned about the economy, but a huge number are concerned about the economic impacts of this virus. So knowing this information, it's really important to develop your company plans so that you've got employees that are thinking like the gentleman here on the right, not the one on the left. So where to begin? The new normal, you know, I'm hesitant to even use that word because I think it's become cliche. In my mind, normal means always being prepared for change. You know, when you look at a farmer, which I'm proud to be here in Hartland Township, we prepare we go and buy seeds, which you might consider not important, but really it is because there's so many different types of seeds available. So if you can equate your employees to being seeds, we're careful on what we're buying, just like you as a business owner have been careful on who you hire. A farmer has to prepare the field. So my analogy in this case is that a business has to develop the structure and provide the support for that business to function. And that could be, in my case, growing hay and corn, adding nutrients and supplemental irrigation. In the case of the business, we need to provide them with the environment for your employees to succeed. But, regardless of how well I do as a farmer, my output at the end of the year during harvest is dependent largely on the amount of sunshine we get. And in this analogy, I'm telling you that you as the business owner have to be the sunshine, both figuratively and literally, for your business to provide that opportunity for growth. This is the standard operating procedure cover sheet that ERG developed for our own employees that talks about how we're going to decontaminate our vehicles and other field equipment that's shared by multiple people. Another thing as business owners that we have to consider is insurance. And this is pretty key because and I'm going to reserve some comment from Brandon on this in a few minutes, but I understand that a worker that does contract COVID-19 can file workers' compensation claims. From the insurance point of view, cybersecurity really becomes key because so many other people are working remote from the office, and the potential for risk and viruses to the computer system is also quite significant. It's been said that COVID-19 is probably going to have 3 phases. We're kind of been through the health crisis in Michigan now. The economic crisis is still to be determined on how bad it impacts the economy. But the 3rd phase that people are gearing up for is the liability crisis. And so as such, it's important that each business considers the long-time financial impacts of your COVID response. The response that we put together as employers is key because we want to remain in business, but to do so, we need both employees and customers. This has become such a big point now that in a lot of the large agricultural clients that I work with, like Smithfield Foods and Tyson's, those types of companies, the stakeholders are looking at a 3-pronged approach now. It used to just be plain old sustainability, but now even the financial institutions are looking at how businesses develop their environmental, social, and governance concerns. So this new term is called ESG, and I'm sure you're going to be hearing more about it in the future. So we've got, the recognized experts that have been telling us, and I have to be honest, they're doing their best, but even their story changes from time to time. I think the same could be said for our governor's executive orders. And we also have to consider Michigan MIOSHA. So for today, we want to really concentrate on these last two. And I will say that efficiency and clarity are not concepts that are typically connected to the political workings of Washington, D.C. or Lansing in the best of times. So it's no wonder that COVID-19 has brought us scratching our heads. And for this particular reason, that's why we wanted to bring Brandon in. And I'm going to turn it over to him now. We're going to start by talking about the COVID-19 and response plan. I've shown here the one that was developed by our company, and he's going to be able to explain why these are necessary and important moving forward. And the rest is yours.
Hey, Matt, thanks. And thank you for the information. I really appreciate that. I know everybody's gained a lot from your wisdom about leadership and management and those sorts of things. It's kind of funny you said, why do you need one? Well, you need one for starters because the governor says in her executive order that you need one. And so that has to be consistent with OSHA guidelines and specifically the executive order. And I'm reading off of Executive Order 2020-114 now, specifically references the OSHA guidance on preparing workplaces for COVID-19. This is a document that you can find online. It's available. There's also a link to it at the end of this presentation in the additional resources slide. And OSHA, since this executive order, has actually put out a subsequent guidance document called Guidance on Returning to Work. And so these documents really highlight the importance of being prepared and conducting workplace assessments so that you know which workers may or may not be subject to higher risk, depending on who they're having contact with and how often they're having contact with folks. So, these are important things to keep in mind, especially because there's actual implications for OSHA and OSHA violations. And actually, Matt, can you go back just one slide for 1 second? So we see here the areas of law that are in play: federal and state law, executive orders. You've got actual OSHA regulations, which are binding. You've also got guidance from OSHA, which is not necessarily binding, but it's persuasive. You've got guidance from the CDC. There's other agencies I can think of, such as the World Health Organization. And then you've also got, of course, local public health orders. And so this is a lot of information to keep track of. And as an attorney, it's my job to try and keep track of this stuff. But as business owners, you're the ones that are going to be most directly impacted by changes in these areas. So it is really important to try and keep track of this stuff as best as possible. And one thing I'll say is that at a minimum, I believe truly that employers that aren't working with legal counsel either should work with legal counsel or should familiarize themselves in great detail with the executive orders that affect their industries. And in particular, Executive Order 2020-114 and 115, and Executive Order 2020- I believe it's 36, which deals with workplace protections for employees who decide that they have to stay home because they have COVID-like symptoms. These are really important things to get a handle on because you don't want to expose yourself to an OSHA complaint, you don't want to expose yourself to a lawsuit, and you don't want to expose yourself to some other type of administrative action, whether it be from the Michigan Attorney General or a local public health agency or OSHA or whoever. So go ahead, Matt, if you want, onto the next page here. And so when we talk about a reopening and return to operations and what type of plan you need to put together, the governor's order specifically references the guidance on preparing workplaces for COVID-19 document. And this document contains several different risk classifications for workers that employers should engage in to determine what's the appropriate level of risk and what's the appropriate response to that risk due to this classification. And so right off the bat, from reading these classifications, very high risk, medium risk, and lower risk, you see that the majority of workplaces are probably going to fall in the lower risk or medium risk category, with your high risk and your very high risk categories really involving people that are working in close proximity, maybe in a medical setting or in a nursing care type setting, or a setting where they're frequently having close contact with people that are either known or suspected to have COVID-19. Your workers that are in jobs like retail or in an office setting where maybe you have a reception area where you're having frequent contact with members of the public, but these people are not known or suspected to have COVID-19, that's going to be a medium risk category. And then your lower risk category is going to be somebody like me sitting here in an office by myself where I don't have close contact with members of the general public, and the people that I do have close contact with are not known or suspected to have COVID-19. And so this OSHA guidance document has suggestions for what types of protocols are appropriate. And of note, the lower risk, practicing safe social distancing and things like that, all of the common sense things that you've kind of heard through the news and on the media and press conferences and social media and things like that, primarily having some type of face covering when social distancing can't be maintained, I think is sort of the primary means of protection for your lower risk category workers. And for when you elevate to medium risk, you may see some additional engineering type controls being used, such as your plexiglass barriers. When you go to the grocery store, I'm sure you've noticed that the cashiers and the tellers maybe at banks are separated from you physically with a plexiglass type barrier. Those are the types of things that you're going to see in your lower risk and medium risk settings. Matt, if you want to go ahead and switch me over to the next slide here. So Executive Order 2020-110, this is the order that rescinded the stay home order. This allows people to go out and travel as necessary to do a variety of things, including going to work and things like that. We're still encouraging workplaces to promote remote work to the greatest extent possible, have training in place for your employees, have disinfection protocols and things in place where your employees feel safe and feel comfortable coming in and knowing that the workplace is going to be as safe as we can make it at this time. Go ahead, Matt. On to the next one. So your preparedness and response plan, when we talk about getting employees back to work, should be consistent with the OSHA guidance that we talked about. It should be consistent with doing that risk assessment for your employees and figuring out, okay, are we low risk or are you medium risk? I certainly think there's something to be said for being able to tell an employee, hey, based on government OSHA guidelines, not just something that we're making up as the employer, but based on these actual guidelines, you're low risk for exposure in the workplace. I think there's an extent to which that gives some level of comfort to employees. As an attorney that works with a lot of HR professionals and business leaders, one of the biggest issues is, what if my people don't want to come back to work because they're scared? So to the extent that we can use this to try and make employees feel safe and try and make them feel comfortable, I think that's going to be really important from a management standpoint. Your plan should also include standards for facility cleaning and disinfection. Now, if you're in an office building that maybe has a third-party cleaner come in overnight, I think there's a point to which it makes sense to communicate, have dialogue with that contractor to say, hey, what are you doing? Now, whether that's something you relate to your employees or not is a different matter, but I think it certainly makes sense to have that conversation with whoever's doing your cleaning, whether it's somebody on staff or a contractor, and make sure that everybody's on the same page with, what are the high touch surfaces that are going to be cleaned after hours? How is a deep cleaning going to occur if you think that's necessary? During the daytime, when your contractor may not be on staff or in the workplace, who's going to be responsible for periodically on a semi-regular basis throughout the day doing those types of disinfections and cleanings of your high touch type surfaces, maybe like your doorknobs or other handles and other office equipment, maybe a stapler that is a jointly used stapler, things of that nature need to be considered. Whether or not social distancing can be effectively applied, we've seen office type settings and other type settings, reduce their staff, reduce the number of clients or customers that they can have in the office at any given time. We've also seen, and this kind of dovetails with PPE, we've seen barriers being erected, whether that's between the workers themselves, maybe with like a cubicle type situation, or whether it's between the worker and the client or customer that's coming in, and having something in between that's able to serve as a barrier so that communication is facilitated, but at the same time your worker is protected and feels safe. As far as PPE goes, I think a lot of folks are using gloves, and that's fine. I think as long as you observe the proper protocols with gloves, which are that they should be changed semi-regularly, if not regularly. And keeping in mind also that I think hand washing can probably be just as effective as gloves in certain situations, but you'll want to rely on guidance from medical authorities from that perspective. And then of course, along with PPE comes your face coverings, which should be worn to the extent that social distancing can't be maintained. The executive order, which we'll go over in much greater detail as we go on with this presentation, does require face coverings to the extent that employees are regularly within 6 feet of one another. And if they're regularly within 3 feet of one another, we're supposed to be considering using face shields instead of just a cloth type covering. And then of course, what I guess I could say is the final component to a reopening type plan or a preparedness and response plan would be how you're going to screen employees, how you're going to monitor them, how they're going to return to work once they've been deemed as maybe a suspected COVID case or something like that, and how you're going to notify employees, and then what records, of course, you have to keep after that point. So go ahead, Matt, if you want to jump onto the next slide here. I'm going to try and speed it up a little bit because I think if I'm monitoring the clock right, and Katie can jump in and cut me off at any time, but I think I'm going to at some point be running up against the clock here. So I am not going to go through every point on these next slides in the interest of time, and there's some other things that I think are probably more important to get to, but you need to get on the website and you need to read Executive Order 2020-114. If you're a retailer, there's specific requirements. If you're a barber, there's requirements. If you're an office setting, there's requirements. Construction, manufacturing, these areas all have their own specific requirements under the executive order, and 2 hours isn't enough time, let alone the time that I'm allotted for speaking here to cover all these different things. And they deal with things like, what's your point of access going to be into the workplace? Are you going to have an on-site supervisor that is responsible for implementing and making sure that this plan is followed? These things are all covered in the order. It's not a short order, unfortunately, but if you can jump on there and find your category, there's certain aspects that apply to everybody, and then there's little breakout paragraphs that apply to, say, maybe just a landscaper or just a construction industry business or just a manufacturing business. And so to the extent that you can jump on there and find what applies to you and incorporate those things into your preparedness and response plan, I think you've got a really good, solid plan forming, that is in compliance with these orders, because you've gone through and used it as a checklist to say, okay, I'm in compliance with what the governor wants. I know that because I've gone through and checked off on each thing, and I can tell you where it's present in my plan. So we kind of already talked about this one a little bit. Obviously the standard right now is staying 6 feet away from people to the extent possible. If you can't be at least 6 feet away from people regularly, to wear a mask. How I've seen this being implemented, generally speaking, is that I'm in my office, I'm at my desk, probably don't need to wear a mask here. But if I get up and walk to the restroom, or I'm going about the office where I'm going to be in close contact with people, then that's something where I need to consider wearing a mask. Additionally, the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services talks about close contact, and that generally requires a sort of a prolonged period of time, not necessarily just a passing glance past somebody. So if you're going to be in close contact, so within 6 feet for a prolonged period of time, that's when the mask thing more or less comes into play. If you're just passing somebody in the hallway, the fact that you didn't have a mask on may or may not be relevant, depending on whether the person was symptomatic, coughing, sneezing, or if that person maybe was later determined to have COVID or COVID-like symptoms. I think that would be something that would be relevant. But generally speaking, just walking past somebody in the hall isn't necessarily an area where we think that it's high likelihood of there being a transmission. So I kind of already touched on this, so I'm, in the interest of time, we can probably just go ahead and blow past that one. So, and again, I did touch on this a little bit, but when it comes to talking about a mask policy, you know, there's some type of where we want to keep people comfortable, but at the same time, make sure everybody's safe. Some people are very averse to wearing masks. Other people want to make sure they have them on all the time. And I think there is some wiggle room here. We obviously don't want people that are symptomatic probably in the workplace at all, but certainly somebody that has maybe seasonal allergies or something like that, they need to be encouraged to utilize proper respiratory etiquette, which would be maybe sneezing into a tissue, sneezing into their elbow, wearing a mask, all those types of things that, you know, I teach my 4-year-old, you know, and that she learns in preschool are things that we need to kind of go over that stuff with our workers, and proper hand washing, proper respiratory etiquette. All those things become really important when it comes to maintaining an OSHA compliant workplace. Okay, so exposure notification. And this kind of depends, I think, on the size of your workplace. You know, if you're in a workplace that's located in one office and somebody is, it's a relatively small office with relatively few number of employees, and somebody's determined to have COVID or COVID-like symptoms, who are we going to notify? So at some level there, you know, you can probably assume if you're in a smaller, closer knit workplace that everybody at some point has been in close contact with this individual. And so you may be notifying pretty much everybody in your workplace, you know, that you've had a potential incident. If you have a larger type facility, that may not necessarily be the case. So I think as management, you have to do your due diligence and determine who is this person come into close contact with. In the interest of protecting their medical information, you don't want to identify them by name. Obviously, if you're in a smaller workplace, you're not going to be able to keep that person completely anonymous, but to the extent that you're able to say that, hey, there's been an incident, but we're not going to tell you exactly who it is, but we've taken great pains to go through and determine who we think has come into close contact with this individual, then you should do so. And then those people should potentially be screened for COVID-like symptoms. And we'll talk about on the next slide when people can return to work. And to some extent, you want to check. I looked at Livingston County today. I didn't see any local public health orders. It doesn't mean they're not out there. So you want to make sure that you keep yourself up to speed on any local public health orders that come out from your county. I know that in Wayne County, for example, not sure if it's still in effect, but you had certain requirements. I think the red box here on your screen was taken from partially, at least from a Wayne County public health order. It's also consistent for the most part with CDC guidance on when people can return to work. And there's also an executive order that talks about this too. So there's multiple sources to consider when you're determining who can return to work. But we have kind of two, sorry, Matt, if you could just go back to that for 1 second. You have kind of two different theories here. If you have a test-based strategy, and that depends to a large extent on the availability of testing. And this from the CDC, you have no fever, improvement in respiratory symptoms, and 2 negative COVID-19 tests taken at least 24 hours apart. That's going to be somebody that can return to work. On the other hand, if you don't have testing available, or for some reason you're not going to do testing, you have no fever for at least 3 days, at least 7 days asterisk have passed since symptoms, and your respiratory symptoms have improved. And I say asterisk on the 7 because some sources will say 7. Right now, I just checked the CDC website and they say at least 10 days have passed since the symptoms first appeared. So there's going to be a little bit of play there. And you want to check with your local public health department to make sure that you're in compliance with what they require, in addition to your state emergency orders and CDC guidelines. So go ahead, Matt, on the next one. I'm not gonna belabor this too much. As far as enforcement goes, you can have administrative enforcement through MIOSHA, or you can have enforcement of the executive orders through local authorities, or potentially even from the Attorney General's office. But in the interest of time, I'm not gonna hit on that too much. WorkShare talks about how do you bring people back to work with a financial incentive. Again, if you're interested in that, there's a lot of information up on the state unemployment insurance agency website. I'm going to refer you to that for more information, but it is a good resource for employers that are having difficulty bringing employees back to work. Allows them to utilize a partial unemployment benefit along with their salary and wages and maintain their fringe benefits as well. Go ahead on to the next one, Matt. So with remote work, I think it's important to remember that we're talking about promoting remote work, but do we have the infrastructure to actually support that? And usually when you think about infrastructure, you're thinking about things like IT, but I'm talking about workplace policies and practices and proper management policies that are going to support remote work. So, you know, how are you tracking people's time if they're hourly? You know, because you have a duty obviously to pay minimum wage, at least for all hours worked, and time and a half for any overtime worked. So you want to make sure you have clear policies on what type of time is able to be recorded and when people are able to actually work. You want to have policies on how to treat company-owned property, how to access the network, and how to deal with protected type company information. That's all really important stuff to protect your interests as the employer and also to manage the risk of potential wage and hour violations. So for screenings, you know, I think people are doing things differently, and to some extent it will depend on what industry you're in, because the executive order does have mandates for maybe construction and manufacturing that wouldn't necessarily apply to the office setting. So you want to make sure you're up to speed on that. But generally speaking, you want to know, do people have COVID symptoms? Do they have a temperature? And for generally speaking, you talk about temperature being about 100.4 or higher. Or subjectively feeling feverish. So, you know, I might get worked up drinking coffee and walking into the office, but my 99.2, you know, temperature doesn't qualify me as having a fever for purposes of having to leave the workplace. So it's just important to keep things like that in mind and to mandate that employees tell you if they have a change in condition, or if you're going to actually require a written screening every single day. Then I think that's something you need to be upfront about with the employees, and you need to treat that as protected and confidential employee health information. So this just talks about confidentiality. Medical records and medical screenings should be kept separate from the personnel file. So this kind of gets into some of the different little hairy areas that can come up. A lot of people have questions about the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. That could be an hour-long webinar in itself. Suffice it to say that if an employee is out for a COVID-19 related reason, you need to be checking with either HR or legal counsel to determine if this is a leave that's going to be protected and paid under the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. And remember that just because the stay-home order has been lifted, this leave stays in effect potentially through December, maybe longer if extended. So just because your stay-home order is no more doesn't mean that this leave won't apply. So we need to still be conscious of it as we move forward. And it applies to any employer just about with less than 500 employees. So that encompasses probably everybody on this call, I'm going to guess. Your regular FMLA provisions still apply. So somebody that may be sick or has a family member that's ill that qualifies for regular FMLA, to the extent that you qualified under the old FMLA, that's still going to be applicable. And then the Americans with Disabilities Act is something that we're going to touch on in a few slides, I believe, or in one slide. So the ADA applies to employers with 15 or more employees. Michigan's Persons with Disabilities Civil Rights Act applies to pretty much every employer in Michigan. And so COVID-19 raises a lot of issues with respect to mask wearing and things of that nature. And so employees potentially with moderate to severe asthma or that have some type of other respiratory condition may not be able medically to tolerate a mask. And so we need to talk about, as employers, engaging in the interactive process with the employee to determine if there's a reasonable accommodation that can be made short of wearing a mask, maybe that will trigger a severe asthma attack. And these are all very, very fact sensitive, situation specific issues. So I can't just tell you, hey, somebody with asthma doesn't have to wear a mask, because that's not necessarily the case, because somebody with very mild asthma may not be entitled to an accommodation, but somebody that when their asthma flares up, it's life threatening, probably would be entitled to an accommodation. So it's going to really depend on the situation. It's going to depend on the individual employee. But the important thing as an employer is to be able to issue spot and know that, hey, this is an area that I need to be a little bit careful of. Maybe I bring in experienced HR, or maybe I look at legal counsel to help identify the proper course of action in this situation. But it's not something where you can just give a blanket answer to yes or no. You know, it's something that you really have to dig into the facts on and determine whether an accommodation can be made. Important also to note that a reasonable accommodation is just that, reasonable. It doesn't mean the employee gets to run the show and determine whatever they think is reasonable. It means that as an employer, you engage in an interactive process with them to come up with an accommodation that's reasonable to the point where they can still do their job, but they're accommodated in that if they have a disability, they can still perform the main functions of that job. And so the things that have come up are modified work schedules, leaves of absences, remote work. These things could all potentially be reasonable accommodations, but again, it really depends on the situation and whether or not with an accommodation, can that employee perform essential job functions? Because if the answer is no, if you're in retail, for example, maybe, and you need to be in person to deal with customer transactions, remote work's probably not going to be a reasonable accommodation for that person because they can't perform essential job functions. So these are situations that you need to dig into on a case-by-case basis. So the National Labor Relations Act, contrary to what some people think, also applies to non-unionized workplaces. And so employees that engage together in protected concerted activity could potentially be entitled to job protections. And this could apply to things like social media posts that, hey, my employer is a blank blank because of these safety issues or because of these wage issues. Those types of things may be protected concerted activity. And if you terminate or discipline an employee for something like that, you could be on the hook for an unfair labor practice, some probably really negative media publicity, and you open yourself up to potential unionization attempts because labor unions will probably use something like that to appeal to employees that, hey, you should think about bringing the union in because you see they're interfering with your rights that are guaranteed at law. So those are areas where as employers we have to be careful because we think that, hey, this is an at-will employment relationship, this is a non-union shop, so I have broad management discretion to do what I want with these employees, but just words of caution that if they're engaging together or if one employee is speaking on behalf of other employees, this could potentially be protected concerted activity that you need to be careful how you navigate. And it's going to be important to deal with somebody that has experience with unionization and maybe experience with labor relations type matters in order to address how to deal with that type of situation. Okay, so I did try and blow through that stuff. To the extent there's questions, feel free to jump off with them. I believe Katie's going to kind of facilitate that. I do have 3 questions, I think, on the slides that were like really frequently asked. So I just went ahead and included them in the presentation. The first one was, what if an employee refuses to return a report to work? There's steps you can follow here on the screen, but essentially, unless it's some type of protected reason that they won't return to work, at the end of the day, you have somebody that won't return to work, and how would you normally treat that person? And I think we probably all know the answer to that. One of the things that kept coming up was this person's making more on unemployment. They won't come back to work. Well, that's not really a legitimate reason to not come back to work is because you're making more on unemployment. So generally speaking, under the unemployment statute, you have to take an offer of work that's, more or less reasonable offer. So, being asked to return to your old job that you were at probably qualifies as that. And so as an employer, I say you probably should notify the unemployment insurance agency that this employee has refused an offer of employment and let them take it from there, because I don't think it's right that they're still on that benefit when their job was held for them and offered to them. Now, of course, you don't necessarily have to disclose that, I guess, to the UIA, but I certainly wouldn't want to be on the hook for anything coming from the agency in terms of, well, we're going to charge your account now because you didn't tell us or something to that effect. So I think it's really important that you maintain open communication with employees on this issue and also with the UIA. But generally speaking, you're going to want to see if the reason that they're not returning to work implicates some type of protected category. Under Michigan executive order, do they have COVID or COVID-like symptoms? Are they indicating an FMLA issue or some type of disability where you may need to accommodate in some fashion? And then if you go through all those steps and you see that, no, this is not a protected reason to refuse to work, do you have some type of business sense of, is this person such a key employee or am I so short-staffed that it makes sense to give this person a 1-week extension or something like that. That's going to be a business decision. As an employer, generally speaking, time isn't on your side because this gives the employee time to kind of build a case as to why they may have a disability or why they may have some other type of situation that's protected. So, you know, I think to the extent that you make this decision, you need to take all those things into consideration prior to, you know, whether it's let the employee come back to work at their own pace or whether it's let them come back maybe with some restrictions such as work from home or a limited schedule or something like that. So this has come up a lot as well. What about an employee who refuses to wear a mask? Well, this is a workplace policy, right? So you can enforce it just like you would enforce any other workplace policy. The only sense of caution that I urge is, are they not wearing a mask because of some type of medical condition or some other type of condition that may be protected? That would maybe dictate perhaps some type of accommodation. But I think the starting point is that, hey, this is a workplace policy. Unless there's some reason why, you know, you're legally required to modify it for this individual, generally speaking, you could enforce that the same as you would your attendance policy or anything else. Before I do this though, the one issue though was, if you could go back a slide for a second, sorry about that, Matt. Is this a disciplinary thing or is this something that you could use as a training or a teaching moment? You know, maybe it's somebody that's been misinformed or that's been, you know, watching some type of social media craziness or whatever. And maybe they just need to be educated to the extent that, hey, your coworkers don't feel safe if you're not wearing your mask, you know, and maybe that's enough. Maybe you don't need to fire them or suspend them without pay. Maybe it's something that you could use it as a counseling type moment and document it that way instead of official discipline. So that's all I have to say about that one. Go ahead, Matt. Do you have to provide copies of your plan? Up until recently, you really didn't have to. It had to be available. And technically, you still don't have to provide it, but it does have to be readily available now. So within 2 weeks of reopening, you have to have your preparedness and response plan available to employees, customers, and labor unions. And that could be through a hard copy or through something up on your website, perhaps. And so with that, I think I've talked enough. And I'd like to hear from some of the potential questions that you guys have, or maybe Matt has a couple other things to toss in there. But my throat's starting to get dry because I talked so long now. So.
No, I think I'll pass it back to Katie.
Okay, thank you so much. Matt, do you mind? Oh yeah, if we could keep this up for a minute. I see that you have some additional resources on this is this the last page of your slide? Oh boy.
That one's the last
So
one.
here's my big question for you, Matt. Is this presentation available? Is this something that I can share afterwards with everybody that attended today's webinar?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So I'll send that out to everybody after the webinar, and I'll also, this is being recorded, so I'll include a link for you to view it again. So we did have a couple of questions that came in. I know we're kind of pushing here on time. But we had, and this is for Brandon, I believe, but can employers force their employees to get tested for COVID, similar to a drug test per se?
So the current EEOC guidance on this is that you may require COVID testing, but you may not require antibody testing. And this is from, obviously there's no statute or rule on this, so we're going by the guidance that the EEOC has released on the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so, you know, when it comes to re-engaging the workforce, you may require COVID testing because COVID-19 constitutes a direct threat. So you potentially want to know, you know, if somebody has it. Currently, obviously, that person would be excluded from the workplace. But the difficulty with that is that testing may not necessarily be widely available. And secondly, that only tells you on the day that the swab was taken whether or not that person had COVID-19. So I don't know how useful it's going to be to have a test that is taken right after somebody's been isolated for 60, 90 days or whatever. And then all of a sudden now they're back in the workforce, they're back engaging with customers and clients, and they're back going to the grocery store and doing other types of activities that are now allowed under executive orders. And so it really only tells you at that moment in time, does the person have COVID-19? You know, and so I just am not sure how useful it's going to be and whether the expense is worth it. But I do know that the ADA the EEOC, consistent with the Centers for Disease Control guidance, has said that the antibody testing is not at a level where it's reliable enough to indicate that it should be used to make workplace type decisions.
Well, and then you're dealing with HIPAA too on top of that, which leads me, someone had asked about that. So actually the question specifically is, how do we treat work situations if a family member has had or has COVID-19, however, was not divulged due to the HIPAA? So that's a whole nother ball of wax, is the HIPAA,
Well,
correct?
yeah, so HIPAA generally applies to like healthcare providers, not necessarily to employers, but
Okay,
there definitely are some restrictions under both OSHA and the Americans with Disabilities Act that do require confidentiality of medical information and medical screening and things like that. So I'd be very careful with stuff like that. But generally, if you have a household member that has COVID, I think that's certainly a situation where you'd want that person to follow the return to work guidelines.
for sure. Well, thank you. My colleagues, do you have any questions for our fine panelists today?
I don't. Thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Oh, go ahead, Pam, sorry.
No, I think it's great that you're going to share the video and a lot of valuable information straight from the source. So we sure do appreciate it.
Yeah, there was definitely a lot of information. We really appreciate all that you shared with us. I know, like you said, that one topic we could have went into a whole nother webinar. So maybe we'll talk. But anyway, so
We're happy to.
yeah. So again, thank you everyone for tuning into the webinar. I know we're just a few minutes over time. Thank you, Matt, Peggy, Brandon, for your time today. Very informational, and we're looking forward to sharing it beyond just who attended today. So thank you again.
Absolutely. Thanks very much for having me, everybody. I
Thank you.
appreciate it. And for everybody out there, thanks for attending. It was good to be a part of this discussion.
Thank you.
I echo that too. Have a
All
great
right.
Day.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you,
Ditto.
Peggy.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Brandon.
Bye-bye.
Everyone. Thanks again.